The prairie wind carried more than the scent of rain that night. It carried silence, and in the Old West, silence always meant something was dying. There was a weight to the hush that blanketed the land, thick as a quilt left too long in the cellar, damp, musty, pressing. It wasn't the stillness of peace. It was the kind that crept in before betrayal. Clara Whitlow felt it in her chest before her mind put a name to it. Not fear exactly, not yet. But something close. Something that fluttered like a wounded bird caught in a barrel. She sat near the edge of the dying campfire, her knees drawn close, the hem of her woolen dress browned by dust and wear. Across from her, the last embers pulsed like the end of a heartbeat. One more breath, then done. She pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders. The cold wasn't what made her shiver. Years ago, her mother once told her, "If a man goes quiet too long, girl, he's either praying or plotting." Clara hadn't understood it back then, not when she'd first heard it in the parlor of their family's old stone house outside of Concord. But now, on this raw piece of prairie land in the Wyoming Territory, with the men speaking in murmurs at the far end of camp, she understood it, bone deep. The fire crackled softly behind her. The men's voices, lower and harder than usual, drifted from beyond the canvas of their wagon. She couldn't make out the words, only the tone, dry, tight, like wood about to splinter. Beside her, Edith Varnell stirred in her sleep, curled under a thin wool blanket. Her face, even in slumber, bore the strained lines of someone trying not to cry out. There was a bruise forming on her cheek, high and dark, like a fingerprint stamped into her skin. Silas had done it the night before. Not in rage, not with a shout, just one backhand, quick as a blink, when she dared to say they were out of flour. Clara had found her in the dark, wiping the blood off her lip with the edge of her apron, refusing help, refusing tears. On Edith's other side, Joetta Marsh lay with her arm flung over her eyes, her chest rising in uneven rhythms. The youngest of the three, Joetta still carried the vestiges of girlhood in her features. She'd once glowed at the mention of Nolan's name, had spoken sweetly of their first dance under the oil lamps of Dry Cedar Bluff town, where he'd promised her a cabin and warm winters, but those dreams had worn thin by the time they reached the plains. Nolan no longer spoke of cabins or futures. He barely looked at her at all. Clara's hands tightened into fists against the worn fabric of her skirt. She didn't trust any of them. Not Nolan, not Silas, and certainly not Burke Maddox, her own husband, who now sat just beyond her sight, his silhouette a jagged mass against the larger fire the men had built for themselves. She'd married him because he was strong, because he knew how to ride, to shoot, to survive. But love? No, he'd never offered her that. He married her like a man might buy a mule, strong back, quiet mouth. And when she had opened her mouth too many times, he'd made it clear she'd overstepped her place. Tonight, he hadn't even looked her way. None of the men had. Something's coming, Clara thought. She didn't know what shape it would take yet, but she could feel it. Slithering through the tall grass, waiting. She glanced again at the wagon's shadow. The glow of Burke's pipe flared red, then dimmed. A moment later, Silas's laugh, short and dry, split the night air like a bone snapping. Clara's stomach turned. She leaned over and touched Edith's shoulder. "Wake up," she whispered. Edith stirred, brow furrowed, but said nothing. Clara nudged again, firmer. Edith blinked her eyes open, confusion swimming in them. "What is it?" "Something's wrong," Clara whispered, glancing over her shoulder. "They're planning something. I don't trust them." Edith gave a small, bitter laugh. "You never trust them. This is different." Joetta shifted beside them. Clara reached out and touched her arm gently. "Joey," she said. Joetta bolted upright, eyes wide. "What? What happened?" "Nothing yet," Clara said. But we need to listen. They crept forward on hands and knees, keeping to the dark, skirts brushing silently against the grass. They reached a rise in the land near the men's wagon, crouching just below the lip of earth, where the firelight flickered up against the low canvas and caught the edge of Burke's boots. The voices were clearer now. "They'll slow us down," Silas was saying, "and you know it." "They'll get us killed," Nolan added. "Leave 'em," Burke said, voice like gravel. "We take the horses, the wagon, and what supplies we can carry. Let the prairie deal with 'em." "They'll die out here," Nolan said, voice weaker than before. "That's not our problem," Burke replied. Edith made a soft sound, a gasp, or maybe just the last bit of air leaving her chest. Clara grabbed her wrist and held tight. Joetta's breathing quickened. "They wouldn't," she started. "They would," Clara said flatly. Below them, Burke stood, kicked dirt over the fire, and began rolling up his blanket. "We leave before first light," he said. Silas nodded, stretching his arms. Fewer mouths, fewer problems. Joetta's mouth hung open, and she stared down at them like she couldn't believe her ears. Clara tugged her back, deeper into the shadows. "What do we do?" Edith whispered. Clara's mind raced. They had no food, no rifles, no way to outrun them. If they stayed, they'd die. If they tried to follow, they'd be left with nothing but tracks in the dirt. And yet... "We need to take the horses," she said. Joetta blinked. "They'll hear us." "Not if we're quiet." "You think we can outride them?" Edith asked. Clara met her gaze. "Then we die fighting." That was all there was to it. They moved low, creeping through the dead grass. The horses were tied near the broken fence, their heads down, chewing idly. Clara moved first, whispering to the mare, her voice soft, even. Joetta reached for the reins, breath held tight. A sound cracked the night, the scrape of boot on stone. Clara froze. Then Burke's voice, thick and slow. "Going somewhere?" Joetta let out a yelp as Nolan grabbed her and yanked her backward. Edith tried to run. Silas caught her by the arm and twisted. Clara turned to face Burke, his rifle already raised. The butt struck her jaw. She fell to the earth. The sky spun. Dirt filled her mouth. She choked on the taste of it. Burke knelt beside her, gripped her chin. "You always were the stubborn one," he said. "Almost makes me admire you." Then he shoved her face into the dirt. Her world narrowed to pain, dust, silence. Somewhere nearby, Joetta screamed Nolan's name. Edith's sobs cut the air like a rusted saw. The men climbed aboard. The wagon creaked. The horses groaned. Then hoofbeats. And then nothing. Only wind. When Clara came to, the sky was still dark, but the stars had shifted. Her lip bled, her cheek throbbed, but her breath was steady. Beside her, Edith sat hunched, rocking slightly, eyes glassy. "They left us," she said. "I know," Clara whispered, wiping the blood from her chin. Joetta sat in the dirt, her skirt torn, arms around her knees. "We're going to die." Clara looked at her, at Edith, at the prairie. She didn't know if she was lying when she said it, but she said it anyway. "No," Clara said, her voice quiet but certain. "We're going to survive." The prairie said nothing back, but the wind picked up again, this time colder, sharper. It carried away the last warmth of the fire. It carried the scent of horses, already long gone. It carried the sound of a promise Clara hadn't meant to make, but couldn't take back, and the prairie listened. Because out here, the land didn't care about right or wrong. It only cared who kept moving. The prairie swallowed their hoofbeats, and in their place, only the cold wind remained, whispering over the bone-dry grass. "You're on your own." At first light, the prairie didn't look any kinder. It just looked emptier. Sunrise came in a hush, not in color or glory, but in a dull sweep of gray across the vast, breathless land. The wind had shifted, lighter now, as if the sky was watching what the night had left behind. Clara Whitlow stood with her arms crossed tight around her ribs, her lip cracked, blood dried on her chin. Her eyes followed the empty trail that led eastward, where the wagon wheels had carved two cruel lines across the earth, and where her husband's boot prints had faded into nothing. She remembered, in some crooked part of her mind, a dime novel she'd once read as a girl, a story about a wagon train that vanished in a blizzard somewhere near the Montana line. The pages had spoken of snowdrifts, of men freezing upright in their saddles, of women whispering prayers through frost-bitten lips. But none of those books ever told the truth about the heat, about the silence, about waking up in full sunlight with nothing and no one between you and death but your will to crawl. That's what this was now. No frostbite, no snow, just dry mouths and a horizon that went on forever. Edith was awake, but hadn't spoken. She sat near the burned-out ring of ash where their fire had once crackled, her face drawn and pale, as if speech would only drain what little she had left. The bruise on her cheek had darkened to purple overnight. She ran her fingers along the edge of her shawl, rubbing the same threadbare line over and over again. Joetta sat beside her, staring down at her raw feet. Her boots had split at the seams, toes poking through like pale ghosts. Her dress, once blue and crisp with lace at the collar, hung limp with dust and sweat. Her hands trembled as she tied what was left of her kerchief around her ankle. Clara swallowed the bitterness in her mouth. It was thicker than thirst. "We need to move," she said. Her voice was hoarse, almost foreign, like it belonged to a woman much older, much harder. But she didn't repeat herself. She just stood still, waiting for them to rise. Edith looked up, her eyes shadowed. "There's nowhere to go." "There has to be." Joetta let out a short, dry laugh. It was hollow, brittle. "Even if we find someone," she said, "who's to say they won't be worse?" Clara knelt in front of her, not tenderly, but with focus. "We don't have a choice," she said, her voice low. "If we stay, we die. Out there we might not." Edith didn't argue. She simply rose, slowly, joints stiff, and brushed the dust from her skirt, like it mattered. Clara helped Joetta to her feet. Her sister wobbled, but nodded. There was no more space for softness now. They moved. The prairie stretched open before them, a sea of scorched grass and whispering wind. The sun had only begun to climb, but already the heat pressed down, like a hand on the back of the neck. The dirt cracked beneath their steps. Every breath they took felt heavier than the last. Clara led, not because she knew the way, but because her feet kept moving. That was enough. Hours passed. The light turned harsher, the air drier. The girls grew slower, heads bowed. Joetta stumbled more than once, catching herself on Clara's arm. Edith fell silent altogether. At noon, they reached a slope where a crooked tree stood alone, its limbs like twisted fingers clawing at the sky. Clara called the halt there. It wasn't shade, not really, but it was something. They collapsed beneath it, backs against the flaking bark, limbs limp. Clara tried to keep watch, her eyes on the horizon, but her vision swam. Her tongue stuck to her teeth. A small cut on her knuckle throbbed in time with her pulse. She leaned her head back and stared at the sky, wide and white and cruel. Joetta moaned softly. Edith's eyes fluttered shut. And then, Clara heard it, a sound that didn't belong to the prairie, faint, rhythmic, deliberate. Hoofbeats. Clara sat up, heart hammering. She squinted into the distance, shielding her eyes. The wind carried it closer, hooves against dry earth. More than one, and fast. She shook Joetta's shoulder. Someone's coming. Edith sat up, groggy, her breath short. It's them. It's Burke. We don't know that. Clara stood and scanned the ridge. Shapes appeared. 3 riders silhouetted against the sun. They moved in a line, slow and sure, as if they'd been tracking for some time. Dust rose behind them in a lazy curl. They weren't white men. Clara froze. She'd never seen the Lakota this close before, but she knew the look of them. The long hair, the painted horses, the way they sat tall in the saddle, like the land owed them nothing. They were lean, quiet, and sharp as flint. The leader rode a dark horse and bore himself with stillness, not arrogance. His eyes scanned the ridge below with the quiet of a hunter. 2 others flanked him, one older, one younger. The older man's face was weathered, lined by years of sun and smoke. The younger one looked barely older than Joetta, but his posture was all tension, like a bow strung too tight. They stopped several yards away. Clara stepped forward, arms raised slowly. "We mean no harm," she said. Her voice cracked on the word harm, but she held her ground. The leader did not move. His gaze swept from Clara to Edith and Joetta, noting the bruises, the torn fabric, the desperation. He spoke, but the words were not in English. Still, Clara knew a question when she heard one. She gestured behind her, toward the open land. "Husbands," she said. "Gone. Left us. No food. No water." The younger warrior muttered something. It didn't sound kind. The older man remained silent. The leader stared at Clara. Then, wordless, he reached for the water skin at his hip and tossed it to her. She caught it with fumbling fingers and unscrewed the top. The first swallow burned down her throat. It was warm and tasted of leather. But it was water, and it made her eyes sting with sudden tears. She passed it to Edith, who drank greedily, then to Joetta, who let it spill down her chin. Clara looked up again. The leader said something to his companions. The younger one scowled and turned his horse away, clearly displeased. The older man nodded. The leader gestured toward his horse. Clara understood. He was offering them a ride. Behind her, Joetta whispered, "Can we trust them?" Clara didn't answer right away. She looked back at the cracked land, the sun that showed no mercy, the sky that promised no end. Then she turned and nodded. The older man dismounted and helped Edith up, moving slowly, patiently. He didn't touch her more than needed. The younger one hesitated, then extended a hand to Joetta. She looked at Clara. Clara gave her a nod. Joetta allowed herself to be pulled up, still shaking. Clara moved toward the leader's horse. He watched her without expression. Then he reached down, caught her wrist, and pulled her up behind him. His grip was firm, not rough, not soft, just real. The horse turned, and for the first time in days, Clara didn't feel like she was dying. They rode without speaking. The wind picked up, but it didn't burn. The land passed by in a blur of grass and hills. Clara didn't know where they were going, but she clung to the saddle, not out of fear, but because something inside her had unlatched, something she'd been holding closed since the first bruise, the first threat, the first silence. She glanced at the man before her. She didn't know his name, didn't know what he thought of her. But he had stopped. He had given her water. He had pulled her from the edge. That was enough. For now. She leaned slightly, letting her eyes close just for a moment. They were no longer alone, and in the distance, hidden between the ridges and pines. Eagle Hollow waited. Clara looked down at the water skin in her hands, then up at the man who gave it to her, and wondered what price trust would carry this time. The valley below looked like something out of a dream, until you remembered dreams could be traps, too. Clara hadn't spoken since the ride began. Her fingers clung to the rough hide of the saddle, her body swaying in rhythm with the horse's gait. She kept her head slightly lowered, not from shame, but from caution. The land opened before them, and though her eyes took in the changing shape of hills and trees, her mind remained tight around a single pulsing thought. You're not safe yet. Somewhere deep in her memory, she could hear the old hymn her mother used to hum while mending socks by the kitchen fire. Take me to the valley low, where I shall walk with strangers slow. She used to think it was a song about heaven. Now she wasn't so sure. The riders crested a final ridge, and what Clara saw below halted her thoughts altogether. Nestled in a shallow bowl of earth was a village like no place she had ever seen. Small lodges made of hide and pole stood in half circles, smoke rising in thin trails from their centers. Children darted barefoot between tents, their laughter strange but bright. Women moved with purpose, pounding corn, hanging meat to dry, weaving with their hands. It was quiet, but alive, balanced, not a camp, not a battleground, a home. And it took her breath from her chest. The lead rider, this man who had handed her water and not asked a single question, rode in without ceremony. The other two followed behind, with Joetta and Edith mounted beside them. No one ran to greet them, yet no one pointed rifles or knives either. Faces turned, yes, some curious, some cool, one or two openly disapproving, but not hostile. The riders came to a stop near the edge of the village, and Clara was helped down. Her knees wobbled when her boots touched solid ground again, and for a moment she wavered. The man who had led them, he remained on his horse. His eyes scanned the perimeter once, then met hers. He nodded. Clara didn't nod back. She was too busy trying to decide if this was salvation or just another kind of cage. A small lodge had been prepared for them. It sat apart from the others, near the edge of the trees. It wasn't large, but inside it was clean and cool. With furs laid on the floor and a bundle of dried herbs hung near the entrance. Someone had lit a small fire in the center, and the scent of sage and pine seeped through the air. Clara ran her hand along the edge of a buffalo hide, marveling at its softness. Edith sat on the ground, her back to the wall, shoulders curled in on themselves. She hadn't spoken much since the ride. Her eyes kept drifting toward the flap of the lodge entrance, like she half expected Silas to come crashing through with that familiar scowl. Joetta didn't stay inside long. She stood at the entrance for a few minutes, then slipped away, without a word. Clara let her go. The girl needed to see the world was still wide, still turning. If nothing else, she needed to move. Clara sat cross-legged beside the fire, her body aching from days of strain. Her mind drifted to the man with the quiet eyes, the one who had made the decision to bring them here. She hadn't heard his name, not yet. But around the other fires, whispered through conversations she couldn't understand, she heard a word spoken with a mix of respect and gravity. Lakota. She let the name settle in her chest like warm coals. It didn't matter what it meant. What mattered was that he had looked at her and seen more than a burden. Hours passed. The sun slid down behind the hills. The village changed shape again, growing quieter, shadows growing longer. A woman, older, strong-shouldered, with 2 long braids and deep lines etched into her face, entered the lodge without a word. She carried a pouch in one hand, and a look in her eyes that dared anyone to question her. She knelt before Edith and took the younger woman's hand. Without asking permission, she turned Edith's face gently to the light and examined the bruise. She made no sound, no expression of pity. Instead, she opened her pouch and placed 2 bundles in Edith's palm, one wrapped in cloth, the other loose leaves that smelled of earth and bark. Then she nodded and left. Edith stared at the herbs as if they were foreign tools. She didn't speak, but her shoulders seemed to loosen, just a fraction. Clara didn't ask if she would use them. She knew she would. Outside, Joetta returned, Her cheeks were flushed with sun, but her eyes were alert again. She knelt beside the fire and leaned in, whispering like a child about to share a secret. "They were training," she said. "The younger ones, with bows." Clara looked up. "Did you talk to anyone?" Joetta shook her head. "Not really, but one of them, he saw me watching. I think he laughed at me." Clara arched a brow. Joetta smiled slightly. "So I stood up, like he did, pretended to pull a string." "And?" Joetta shrugged. "He shot an arrow into the sky, perfect straight shot, like he was saying, 'Nice try.'" Clara didn't reply, but part of her for the first time felt something loosen behind her ribs. They were still strangers here, but not unwelcome. That night, Clara sat outside, alone, just beyond the reach of the firelight. She watched the sky darken into a velvet dome. The stars came out, slow and steady, like shy children peeking through curtains. Footsteps approached. She didn't move. Lakota stepped into view, silent as the wind. He looked down at her, eyes unreadable. In his hands was a small bundle, dried meat wrapped in cloth. He knelt and placed it on the ground between them. Clara stared at it. She didn't reach for it. He didn't speak. After a moment, he stood and walked away. She stared at the bundle, heart thudding. It wasn't the meat that made her breath catch. It was the fact that he asked for nothing in return. The next day, Joetta returned to the river's edge. Clara followed at a distance, unwilling to hover, but wanting to keep eyes on her sister. Joetta's laughter drifted back to her, light, like it hadn't been in weeks. She was mimicking the bow stance again, and the boy, Red Moon, they called him, watched her with something that wasn't quite disdain anymore. Meanwhile, Clara wandered toward the lodge circle, watching the rhythm of the village. She saw Edith seated among two older women, her hands moving awkwardly over a bowl of ground corn. Her mouth was set in a hard line, but she didn't stop. She didn't leave. The place was still foreign, still strange. But Clara could not deny the warmth growing in her chest. That evening, as the fires burned lower, a change came. A group of riders returned, men who had been on a long hunt. The village came alive with their arrival, cheers rising, children running to greet them. Among them was one man Clara noticed immediately. His eyes were hard, his jaw clenched. His gaze snapped to her as if drawn by something sharp and familiar. He did not smile. He spoke quickly to Lakota. His words cut through the air. Clara couldn't understand them, but she recognized something deeper than language. Suspicion. The man, Crowhawk, she would later learn, spoke with clipped intensity. Lakota's responses were measured, firm, but calm. Clara stood still, half in shadow. Her stomach knotted. It was clear. Crowhawk did not trust her, did not trust any of them, and perhaps he was not alone in that. Later that night, Lakota approached her again. This time, she stood to meet him. "What did he say?" she asked. Lakota considered her for a moment. His face was unreadable as always, but when he spoke, his voice was quiet. "He does not trust you." Clara clenched her jaw. "And you?" Lakota was silent for a long breath. Then, finally, "You would not have survived." He didn't say more. He didn't have to. Clara searched his face for signs of deception, of hidden expectations, of some trap ready to spring. She found none. Only quiet strength. Only a man who had made a choice and asked nothing in return. The moon climbed higher, silvering the tips of the pines. The wind rustled the lodge flaps. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called once, then fell silent. The village settled into sleep, but Clara stood there a while longer, watching Lakota walk back toward the fire. She did not follow, but in her heart, something followed him anyway. That night, she did not dream of escape. She dreamed of silence, and for the first time, it did not feel like a threat. That night, as the fire crackled low, Lakota stepped into the shadows where Clara sat alone. He said only one word: "Stay." And then he left her with silence again. It was the kind of sky that made cattle restless, and women remember things they'd tried to forget. The air had grown heavier over the last few days, not with heat, but with something else. Thicker, stickier. Every breath hung longer in the throat, like the wind itself was holding its tongue. Clara stood near the edge of the hollow, eyes on the ridge where the trees curved like the back of a slumbering animal. She wasn't watching for danger, not exactly, just listening for it. Waiting. Behind her, the village carried on, but even the normal rhythm seemed altered. The children ran quieter. The drums, when they played, sounded more like heartbeats than celebration. And the women spoke with glances rather than voices. Somewhere nearby, Joetta laughed. The sound a sharp contrast against the silence. Clara turned just enough to see her sister, hair loose and tangled, tugging playfully at a feather tied to her wrist. Red Moon stood nearby, pretending not to watch her, arms crossed, mouth pulled in that crooked line that passed for a scowl. Clara wasn't fooled. She remembered Burke once saying, "When a man's got nothing left to lose, he comes back mean." At the time, she'd thought he was speaking about a thief they'd encountered near Red Rock Post Office. Now, with the storm building in the sky, and that strange tension humming through the valley, she wondered if he hadn't been warning her. The storm hadn't broken yet, but it was coming. You could feel it in the way the birds kept low and the horses paced more than they grazed. Even the smoke from the cooking fires rose straight up, as if afraid to drift. Clara stepped back from the ridge and returned to the lodge. Edith sat inside, her hands in her lap, the faint scent of boiled herbs clinging to her skin. Her face was calmer these days, less sunken, but there was still that tightness around her mouth, like she was biting back a story she wasn't ready to share. Clara crouched beside her, placing a hand gently on her wrist. "You slept?" she asked. Edith nodded once, then, after a moment, "Better." Clara didn't press. Healing was slow. And fragile. Later, Lakota came by with a bundle of firewood. He didn't knock or call, just left it near the entrance, as he had the meat. When Clara stepped out and saw it, he was already halfway back to the lodge circle, his steps easy, unhurried. She watched him go, that same question tugging at her ribs. Why help us? By afternoon, the tension in the village had grown thick enough to chew. Crowhawk paced the outer ring, stopping now and then to speak in low tones with the other men. He shot Clara a glance once, sharp as a knife. She held his gaze, steady. In the field beyond the river, the younger warriors trained with their bows again. Clara watched Joetta circle the group, light on her feet. She mimicked their stances in secret, her body remembering things the mind had not yet fully grasped. Red Moon watched, too. She caught him smirking once and flung a pebble at his boots. That evening, Clara helped an older woman stir a pot over the fire. The woman said nothing to her, but handed her a carved wooden spoon and motioned to stir slowly. The thick smell of elk bone and root vegetables filled the air. Clara's arms ached, but she didn't stop. She found the rhythm in it, the slow swirl of survival. After the meal, as the fire began to die down and the shadows stretched long across the earth, the first rumble of thunder rolled in. It wasn't loud, just a warning. Lakota stepped forward, eyes scanning the treetops. Crowhawk moved to his side. They spoke in short bursts, sharp phrases exchanged like blades. Clara couldn't understand the words, but she knew something had changed. She moved closer. Crowhawk's voice lifted, laced with something that wasn't quite anger, but was close. The others nearby turned to watch. Even the children stilled. Clara's heart beat faster, not because she felt threatened, but because she realized she was no longer invisible. Lakota's voice stayed even, measured, but firm. Clara didn't look away. She knew. The village was deciding whether to keep them or send them out again to die. Just then, a rider appeared on the ridge. The shape moved fast, urgent. The storm behind them broke the edge of the hill in a wall of dark clouds and orange light. The rider reached the hollow's edge and slid from his horse, breathless. His words tumbled out in Lakota, fast and grim. The fire crackled. A gust of wind bent the trees. Dakota's face hardened. Then he turned toward the women, toward Clara, and nodded once. "They are coming," he said. No explanation was needed. Burke, Silas, Nolan. Clara's stomach dropped. She didn't speak. She simply turned and walked back toward the lodge. Joetta met her on the path. "Is it them?" "Yes." Edith had already risen, standing in the middle of the lodge as if she had known the moment the wind changed. Clara gathered what little they had: a water pouch, a strip of dried meat, a bone-handled knife someone had left beside the fire days ago. She tucked it in her boot. Dakota returned with Red Moon and 2 others. They handed Joetta a bow, a real one. She looked at it as if it were a riddle. "Use it if you have to," Red Moon said. Joetta blinked, then nodded. Outside, the drums began. Not war drums, not yet, but close. Clara stood near Dakota as he gave instructions to the warriors. Their weapons were already in hand. No one panicked. This was not a village that feared violence. It simply knew how to meet it. Night fell quickly, and with it came the first sparks of firelight along the ridge. Clara saw the torches before she saw the faces, and then she saw them. Burke rode at the center, his hat low, jaw clenched. Silas and Nolan flanked him. Their expressions were unreadable in the flicker of flame, but their postures spoke volumes. They had come to reclaim what they believed was theirs. Clara didn't flinch. Dakota stepped forward. His voice rang out, not loud, but final. "This is not your place." Burke laughed. The sound echoed against the hills. "She's my wife." Clara's blood turned to stone. He said it like he was claiming a sack of flour. She stepped forward. Dakota did not stop her. She looked Burke in the eye, that old familiarity now stripped of any power. "You left me," she said. "I'm not your wife." Burke's mouth curled. Silas reached toward his coat. Clara's hand drifted to the knife in her boot. The first drops of rain fell, fat and cold, and behind her, the hollow began to breathe as one. The tribe would not run. Neither would she. Clara stepped outside into the rising wind and stared toward the hills. "He's coming back," she whispered. And the prairie did not disagree. Not all storms come with rain. Some bring hooves, fire, and the echo of past sins. The storm moved in slow, like a preacher with bad news, just close enough to darken the sky, but still holding its breath. The wind pushed low across Eagle Hollow, stirring the smoke from the dying fire pits and rustling the fringe of lodge flaps like nervous hands. It was the kind of stillness that only ever came before a fight, when every creature on the land seemed to pause and look toward the hills. Clara stood near the edge of the village, her back straight, her face pale but set. Her eyes hadn't left the ridge since Burke had shown his face again. She didn't tremble. There was no more room inside her for fear, not after what had been taken, what had been endured, and what had been left behind. Only space now for resolve, and something colder. As a girl, she'd once seen vultures circle over a wagon train near dry Cedar Bluff town. They'd hung there in the sky for hours before the sheriff found what was left. Today, she'd seen them again. Not above, but in her mind, black wings circling the part of her that had once been soft. Behind her, Joetta strung the bow Red Moon had given her. Her fingers were clumsy, but her eyes were sharp. She said nothing, but Clara knew what she was thinking. She was thinking of Nolan. She was thinking of every smile that turned sour, every whispered promise that came with a bruise. Edith sat beside the lodge entrance, her lap full of sage, twisting and tying like she'd seen the elder women do. Her hands moved as if in prayer, slow and deliberate. It was not surrender. It was preparation. Lakota moved through the center of the hollow, speaking low and clear to the others. His voice carried not in volume, but in purpose. The warriors nodded, taking up bows and rifles, spears and knives. They did not speak in rage. They moved like men who understood what it meant to be invaded. Clara watched him, watched how he carried the weight of the village on his shoulders, without flinching. When he passed her, he stopped. "They will come fast," he said. "I know. They want to frighten you. They've done worse than frighten me." He nodded once. No pity, no reassurance, just understanding. As twilight bled into dusk, Clara looked to the north where the land dipped and rose like the back of a great beast. Fires moved there, torches bobbing in the dark. They were coming. The village quieted. The children had been taken into the woods, escorted by the elder women. Those who remained stood ready, not in a line, but in a rhythm, spread out like river stones, waiting for the rush of water. Clara held the knife in her boot with one hand, her other curled into a fist at her side. She glanced at Joetta. "If they reach you, run. Don't try to stop them. Don't let them take you." Joetta didn't answer. Red Moon approached, his face unreadable. He handed her 2 arrows, real ones this time. "They will come for you first," he said. "I know." He looked like he wanted to say more. Instead, he stepped back into the shadow beside the gate. And then, from the dark, the first gunshot split the silence. A crack across the sky, like a match to dry paper. Chaos followed. The riders charged down the hill, yelling like devils, gunpowder lighting their faces with flashes of fire. Burke led them, shouting Clara's name like it was a claim, not a memory. Silas was behind him, already firing into the air. Nolan's horse reared beside the others, his expression tight, eyes darting. Clara didn't wait. She moved. Lakota met Burke head-on, both men dismounting in a blur of motion and dust. Their bodies collided, fists flying, boots scraping against wet earth. Clara turned just in time to see Silas raise his pistol toward the lodge. Joetta stepped in front of him. She loosed the arrow. It flew. Not perfect, not straight, but true enough. The tip caught Silas in the throat. He dropped his gun before he could fire again. The air filled with the sounds of struggle, bodies crashing, steel clanging, hooves thudding into soft mud. Clara searched the chaos and saw Nolan charging toward Edith. Red Moon intercepted him, tackling the man to the ground, his blade flashing once in warning. Clara's breath came fast. Her fingers closed around the knife. She saw Lakota fall. Burke's fist had landed hard, knocking the warrior into the dirt. Burke stood over him now. Breath ragged, mouth twisted in that familiar smirk. He raised his boot. Clara didn't think. She ran. Burke's foot came down. Lakota rolled, barely avoiding it. Clara drove the knife deep into Burke's side. He gasped. The smirk faltered. His hand flew to her throat, but he was already losing strength. Blood poured from his ribs. He stared at her, not with hate, but with a kind of baffled disbelief, like he didn't understand what was happening. "You always said I didn't have the stomach for it," she whispered. He staggered. Lakota surged up beside her, knocking Burke back. The man crumpled, knees first, then shoulders, then nothing. Clara stood over him, chest heaving. The knife trembled in her grip, slick with blood. Nearby, Red Moon let out a shout. Nolan had broken free and was running. One of the warriors took aim but held his fire. He was gone. The rest had fled, or fallen. The storm finally broke overhead. Rain fell hard, drenching the earth, washing away the blood, the dust, the fire. Clara sank to her knees. Lakota stood beside her, breathing hard, face unreadable. He looked down at Burke, then at her. He did not speak. He didn't need to. Behind them, Joetta stood in the mud, bow still in hand, eyes wide. Edith walked toward her slowly, her shawl soaked through. She looked down at Silas's body, and didn't cry. She simply turned and walked toward her sister. Clara stood. The rain beat down like absolution. She met Edith halfway. They embraced, shaking and silent. Lakota watched. So did the village. But no one spoke. Not yet. Because sometimes victory was too raw for celebration. Sometimes it was just standing, after everything else had fallen. Clara rose from the dirt, blood on her dress, knife in hand, and Burke finally saw her not as property, but as his ending. Some nights don't end when the sun rises. They end when no more blood needs answering. The rain had passed by morning, but the scent of it lingered, rich, metallic, heavy. It clung to the earth, to the twisted branches of the trees, and to the soaked fabric of Clara's dress. She stood alone at the edge of the hollow, boots planted deep in the churned soil where the battle had played out hours before. Beneath her feet were broken leaves, shattered arrow shafts, and streaks of red already fading into the mud. She remembered her mother's voice then, sharp and matter-of-fact as a snap of kindling. "Justice doesn't yell, girl. It just don't flinch." At the time, she thought it meant something colder. Now she understood it meant something still. Behind her, the hollow moved slowly, as if rising from a long sleep. Lodges stirred with cautious energy. Smoke began to rise again. Someone chopped firewood with slow, deliberate strikes. The children, who had been sent away before the fight, had not yet returned. The silence in their absence was like a held breath. Lakota walked the perimeter. He didn't speak. He nodded to those he passed, but his shoulders remained taut, his movements quiet. Not mournful, measured. Red Moon followed behind him, slower than usual, his bow slung over his back, his gaze unfocused. There was a mark on his cheek, a bruise swelling beneath one eye, but he walked tall. Near the center of the camp, Edith knelt beside a small fire, hands rubbing cedar leaves between her palms. She had not spoken much since the night before. Silas's body had been taken by the storm, buried by water and mud and dawn. No grave, no cross, only the memory of what he'd been and what he'd done. Joetta stood beside her, still holding the bow, though her arrows had been returned. The ribbon Red Moon had tied to her wrist hung limp and muddy, the charm soaked and darkened by the night. She hadn't taken it off. Clara moved slowly through the hollow, not speaking, not being spoken to. It wasn't coldness, just reverence, the kind of quiet reserved for those who had survived something terrible and unspoken. In the center of it all lay the body of Burke Maddox, wrapped in a plain woolen blanket, soaked through and heavy. No ceremony, no stone, no name carved anywhere. Clara looked down at it and felt nothing, no rage, no triumph, not even relief, just stillness. The warriors had offered her the choice, a grave or no grave. She had said only, "Let the land take him." So they did. Later that morning, the fire circle filled again. Women gathered with their baskets of herbs. The warriors returned their weapons to their racks. Slowly, the normal rhythm of life began to hum beneath the weight of what had passed. Clara sat near one of the outer fires, warming her hands. She didn't speak until Lakota approached and sat beside her. Neither of them looked at the other. "There will be no more," he said simply. She nodded. He handed her something small and wrapped in leather, a pendant made from river stone, threaded with a single strand of red. "What is it?" she asked. "Protection," he said. "For the next time." "There won't be a next time," she said, but she took it anyway. Joetta joined them soon after, her face drawn, but quiet. She sat at Clara's feet, head resting on her sister's knee. They stayed that way for a long while, silent, still. By mid-afternoon, the sky had cleared completely. The clouds had drifted beyond the pines, and the river ran full and fast. The grass shimmered in the breeze. Somewhere, someone was singing. A low, wordless tune, soft as ash. Clara walked with Edith down to the riverbank. They didn't speak much. They didn't need to. Edith waded in up to her ankles, the cold shocking her enough to breathe deep for the first time in what felt like weeks. Clara watched her wash her hands, slowly, letting the water carry whatever it could. Joetta stood a little ways off, watching Red Moon. He was showing a younger boy how to notch an arrow. He didn't notice her at first. When he did, he just nodded once and kept working. She smiled, just a little. Later, the sisters gathered near the lodge for the meal. A stew had been prepared: smoked elk, wild onions, a pinch of something bitter Clara didn't recognize. It was hot, and it tasted like steadiness. Like something earned. Crowhawk approached during the meal. He did not speak to them directly, but he nodded at Clara. Not approval, not thanks, just recognition. That night, a small fire was lit near the edge of the hollow. A space had been cleared, and in it the tribe gathered. Not for mourning, not for war, but for the remembering of peace. Lakota stood by the fire, his eyes catching the flicker of flame. He said little, but when he did speak, the words came slow and deliberate. Clara didn't understand the language, but she understood the tone. It was a declaration that they had fought, that they had endured, that they would not be moved. She stood with her sisters just outside the circle. They didn't step in. They weren't part of the tribe, not by blood, but the warmth reached them anyway. As the fire died down, Clara stepped away, walking up the small hill behind the lodge. From there she could see the whole of the hollow, smoke rising, stars beginning to show. The river curling like a silver thread beneath the trees. She let the wind touch her face. It was no longer harsh, no longer full of threats. It just was. Edith joined her, wordless. Then Joetta. They stood together, side by side. Clara didn't speak, didn't cry, but her chest ached with something old and deep, and finally starting to heal. Lakota approached from behind, his presence as steady as the ground. He didn't interrupt. Clara turned to look at him, eyes meeting his. She didn't say a word, and neither did he. They didn't need to, because sometimes the only answer that mattered was the one that never had to be spoken. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, the silence didn't mean danger. It meant peace. The wind carried no warning now, only peace. And Clara, for the first time, didn't brace against it. Somewhere between the hush of pine needles and the groan of worn leather settling into a saddle. You can still hear what was left behind at Eagle Hollow, like a breath held in the soil, like a name carried by the wind that never quite fades, no matter how far you ride. There are places in this world where the land remembers, where broken wagon wheels and torn bits of ribbon lie half buried in the dust, not as relics, but as witnesses, quiet as wildflowers blooming from the cracks of old blood. Sometimes when the twilight bends just right, when the fire dies low and the stars gather without speaking, you can still feel her. Clara Whitlow, boots planted firm, eyes sharp with the memory of everything she lost and everything she dared to keep. Her voice wasn't loud, her knife wasn't meant for vengeance, but her silence held more weight than any bullet, and in the end, it was her silence that spoke the loudest. You see, some women carry the prairie in their bones, the kind of wide, open ache that doesn't ask for sympathy, only understanding. She didn't build monuments, didn't carve her name into any map, but she steadied the world for a moment, and that sometimes is all a soul is meant to do. The wind that once roared through Dead Horse Pass now trails gentler, brushing over the unmarked graves, through the hollow where braided sage still dries by lodge fires, and over the hilltop where 3 women once stood side by side, not as wives, not as victims, but as something stronger, something earned. And maybe somewhere, under that same sky, a girl with tired hands and a bruised voice will remember them, not their names, but the way they stood, the way they refused to vanish, the way they made even the silence belong to them. The horses came and went, the fires rose and fell, the names of men faded into smoke. But her choice, that quiet, final choice to stand her ground, settled like stone in the belly of the land, never asking to be seen, just needing not to be forgotten. Justice doesn't always thunder in, wearing a badge or wielding law. Sometimes it walks in on blistered feet, holding nothing but the truth and the will to keep breathing. And honor, well, it don't die easy. It may be buried, bloodied, or left for crows, but it ain't erased. It waits. It waits in the bend of the river, in the pattern of arrows fletched with memory, in the hands of a young girl drawing a bow because someone once told her she couldn't. It waits in the wildflowers growing near old wagon ruts, purple and gold, like forgiveness that never needed permission. The men are gone now, the ones who thought women were things to leave behind, but the echo of their failure still rattles somewhere, like a loose nail in an old board. And if you listen close, you'll hear the difference between a woman left behind and a woman who chose to stay standing. Edith with her healing herbs and the hush in her hands. Joetta with her ribbon-stained bow and a heart no longer waiting for someone else to make it whole. And Clara, who looked at death not once, but twice, and kept going, not because she was fearless, but because something deep inside her remembered what mattered. That kindness wasn't weakness, that pain wasn't shame, that justice, when it came late, was still justice, and that sometimes the truth doesn't need the world to believe it, just one woman to carry it like a fire that won't go out. So if you find yourself someday near the edge of a story, standing in the long grass with wind at your back, and you think no one sees you, no one hears what you're still holding together, remember Clara. Remember what it means to keep standing even when the horses have gone, even when no one comes back for you. Light a lamp. Open the old pages. Let the smoke drift. Let the wind speak. And if this story settled into your chest like a warm stone, if it reminded you of someone quiet who still mattered, then leave behind a sign, even a small one, to say you're still listening. We tell these tales not to relive the hurt, but to remember the honor, the courage, the choice to survive when the world offered none. And if you still believe in that kind of strength, the kind that forgives but never forgets, then let your voice join ours. Subscribe to this old trail of stories, to this channel of dust and redemption. Because there are more names to remember, more nights to sit by the fire, more truths that never asked to be loud, only to be known. And we'll be here, waiting, ready to tell the next one, just as the wind carries it in.